The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and the work of j.r.r. Tolkien. You're talking to a bit of a Tolkien geek here. I don't own the Hobbit films on DVD or Blu-ray because they're on Netflix. Anyway, we are starting this, and it's going to be a series, and this is part one at this point. There's so much editing I need to do, but we're starting this. So, I found the Lord of the Rings series and Tolkien's work through the films. That's how I discovered it, watching Fellowship for the first time, many lifetimes ago. Then getting the extended edition on DVD for Christmas that year. And over the next few years getting these, which I need to get on Blu-ray. I ended up reading them as a teenager and fell in love. Are you guys ready for an epic ride? The Hobbit. This is where the Lord of the Rings began. The Hobbit is a children's book, and it follows the adventures of Bilbo Baggins. He finds himself, thanks to Gandalf and a company of dwarves, he finds himself caught up in a plot to raid the treasure. It's very simple. It's a lovely story, and it's very sweet. The framing of The Hobbit is interesting because it is not a prequel to The Lord of the Rings, as much as The Lord of the Rings was written as a semi-sequel. Despite having a few characters in common, and a certain ring, obviously, and Gollum, you rarely see many of this. It doesn't actually set up anything of The Lord of the Rings. Its links to The Lord of the Rings, in terms of story, plot, and narrative, unlike the films, are extremely loose. This is a children's book, and it's designed to be read that way. Each chapter is designed to be read to a child, one by one, say at night, or putting the child to bed. Each chapter is designed to be read that way, with Bilbo Baggins learning a valuable lesson or earning respect at the end of each chapter. I have an illustrated version of The Hobbit, which is a lovely edition, and it has gorgeous art dotted throughout. The Hobbit is where it all began. But truly, to understand The Lord of the Rings, it goes a lot deeper and bigger than The Hobbit. As a writer, it's very difficult to criticise. While no writer is truly perfect, there comes a point in a writer's career where many books are not beyond criticism, but no one would care about it. Tolkien is one of those writers. Middle-earth is the setting for the entirety of Tolkien's Middle-earth books. You have a large, rich and deep world with history worth thousands upon thousands of years of history, to say the least, in the subject. Races, people, characters that go as far back in that fictional history of Middle-earth as it can do. You know the origin. Many of the things of Middle-earth are discussed in another book. Next to The Hobbit, in a weird way, the true prequel to The Lord of the Rings. This is quite unusual, because I'm not sure how true this is, but Tolkien wanted to publish this alongside The Lord of the Rings, but his publishers said no, in one form or another. This was published after his death, with the help of his son. So, we go into this, and this basically gives you a history. This is history, this is context to the world. The origins of the rings are talked about. And you get far more of a concept of what sets up what's to come in the terms of the Lord of the Rings universe. Where The Hobbit may set up one or two tiny things, this sets up everything. What you do have, though, is an interesting tonal shift. From the children's books of The Hobbit to the grown-up, deeper and far richer experience that is Lord of the Rings and its other subsequent Middle-earth books. The tonal shift is related to his sons growing up. The tonal shift of that is a good thing. The writer grew, so did his audience. The Hobbit is a journey. It's an adventure. It's something about a hero. And that's what matters. It's an unlikely hero learning life lessons and learning respect. It's a children's book with a lovely message. Where on the other hand, as I sit in a field talking to a camera and feeling somewhat awkward, the film adaptations of The Lord of the Rings are a far bigger issue. I love the films, and that's how I discovered the world. I went out and I read The Lord of the Rings after seeing The Fellowship of the Ring. I didn't read The Hobbit until after. When they adapted The Hobbit to screen, they took a lot of liberties, and it was a very rushed, troubled production. And I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but if you've only seen the film and not read the book, you're in for a very interesting surprise, and a lot of them. The films of The Hobbit set them up as a prequel to The Lord of the Rings. A lot of Lord of the Rings characters appear just for the sake of it. Just for the sake of cameos, or just for the sake of fleshing something out. Some for the better, some for the worst. I do like some of the changes from the book to the screen, but there are also a lot of book to screen issues that I just don't have time for, that I don't want to talk about. I want to give you something a bit deeper. Although Martin Freeman as Bilbo is like the best casting ever. So yeah, for me, who went out there and read them, you realise that the world of Middle-earth and everything that it set up, be it in the film or the book, is so much bigger than the film or the book. At the end of the day, is a true adventure. It's a romp. It has more in common with other adventure novels. High fantasy at the time of The Hobbit, when it was written, was not a thing. Other than the great myths such as Beowulf, the Iliad and the Odyssey, fantasy as we know it did not exist. It also has some other interesting things to note. There are many edits. From the first edition to The Hobbit, to the version that was republished after the time of The Lord of the Rings, many changes happened. Many words have changed. Many of the Lord of the Rings isms that we are familiar with today were not in the first edition of The Hobbit. It changed as Tolkien wrote it. For that reason, people are often confused, because I've seen many message boards and Reddit and Goodreads and all of that, where people talk about The Hobbit, but they don't quite understand its link and its true history. It's always an interesting thing when you read a copy of the original first edition to the version that we all know and love today. We go from The Hobbit, the simple, sweet little Hobbit, to the Goliath, Lord of the Rings, particularly the Fellowship. The Fellowship of the Rings takes what the Hobbit did and blows it out the water. It's a far richer novel. It's an odd one to say that the Fellowship, and I'm not going to give too much away, because we all know the story, and if I talk about the story I'm going to bore you all. The Fellowship, who are so fascinating and so unique. The races, the world, it's far more layered. Where with, say, The Hobbit, it was a very light read. Characters that you deal with throughout this pull you in, and they sit with you, and they embed themselves in you. The Lord of the Rings is simple. In terms of fantasy, it is simple. And take into account, outside of certain classics, this was the first epic fantasy. In a sleepy village in the Shire, young Frodo Baggins finds himself faced with an immense task. As the ring is entrusted to his care, he must leave his home and make a journey across the lands of Middle-earth. It's his journey. It's interpersonal, and it's dark. You end up feeling like there is so much more going on. Characters appear and you get joined by them, and you realise that their own adventure is happening. So, in The Hobbit, the ring lands from Gollum to Bilbo. It's quite a famous scene, but the ring is never really set up. You never learn a huge amount about it. As I said, The Hobbit is not actually a true prequel to The Lord of the Rings in terms of story. It just feeds in some ideas. And he hands that ring to Frodo. Well, Gandalf hands that ring to Frodo after a little bit of drama, to say the least, on the subject. Throughout this, the characters evolve. Bilbo is left and everything goes into the new hands. Sam, Frodo, Merry and Pip. And then you have their other casts flourish in their world. You end up connecting to them and enjoying them. You end up feeling like you're going on this journey yourself. At the end of Fellowship, the Fellowship of the Ring is broken. The characters go their separate ways and the story splits in half. As you come into the Two Towers, things change. The tone shifts. It goes a little bit darker. The Two Towers splits their journey. Gandalf comes back, but as Gandalf the White rather than Gandalf the Grey. The notion of change that this novel has. The novels that make up the Lord of the Rings. It's out the way here and now. The films change a few minor things in adaptation, but I always say it's one of the few times I can say if you've read the book or watched the film, you're not missing out on either experience. The films do an amazing job of covering this story. What I find slightly funny is the films opened up the many, many, many gay jokes. Frodo and Sam, My Heart Will Go On, All That Needs to Be Said. Look it up on YouTube. And actually, I don't know if it's because I saw the films before reading the book, but I always pick up on some very, very small gay subtext. So, completely random footnote on the series. Of my own sanity, I was going to film all this outside and make it big and epic. And I can't do that because British weather. So where do we start? The War of the Ring. The Two Towers and the War of the Ring and the end of the Third Age. That's what the Two Towers is. It's a remarkable ending to something so big. But just because it's an ending doesn't mean it has to fall flat. Just because it is that ending doesn't mean it has to go out on a whimper. The Two Towers pulled you in and the characters, the Fellowship split. The characters grew. Done. Where Return of the King brings them back together. It brings these characters full circle. But they've grown, they've changed, and they've evolved. Conceived The Lord of the Rings as a single volume consisting of 6 books. The original publisher split these into 3 volumes, publishing the 5th and 6th as into the final volume as Return of the King. Tolkien felt the title revealed too much of the story, and he also basically preferred this. I don't know how true this is, but these are talks of these books, that he preferred the title The War of the Ring. The proposed titles of Book 5 was The War of the Ring, and Book 6 was The End of the Third Age. These titles are used in the Millennium Edition of The Return of the King. The King ends on an ambiguous note. Certain main characters, including Gandalf and Frodo, leave Middle-earth. My personal take back from that is that it's a metaphor for death. They can't do anything anymore. They've been through hell. And they have to leave. I am sure that's my only interpretation of that. But when it comes down to it, the notion of the epic hero having to leave, the bittersweetness as they leave to the undying lands, their reward maybe is paradise. Maybe I'm reading too much into that ending. But the whole Catholic subtext of The Lord of the Rings is quite strong. In the big scheme of this, the character that gets the most complete ending is Sam. You revisit him in the works of Tolkien a few times, but Sam is the character with the most complete end. Lies The Return of the King, in terms of fantasy, it is the end log. It is that battle. You see them return, you see the characters meet again but they've changed, and you see that battle, and you see the effects of that battle. You end up feeling for so many of the characters that it's just huge, and it's so difficult to describe. And with this video essays, I just wanted to give you an overview of my take on it all. I always find the end of Return of the King sad. The Third Age has ended. Sam, Merry and Pippin watch Gandalf, Bilbo and Frodo leave, and they all depart and return home. Sam returns to Bag End and is saddened by Frodo's departure. Sam returns to his home at the end of the book. He is greeted by his wife and his daughter. That it's such a bittersweet thing. It's just, it always just makes me feel sad. It's quite a dark book. Most of Return of the King is far darker than the previous two. And it always makes me wonder what kind of mindset Tolkien was in when he wrote it. I would love to have just been there, a fly on the wall. And I have to admit, it's probably my favourite of the Lord of the Rings. I can't do a video on the Lord of the Rings without covering some of the adaptations. So, between 1955 and 56, the BBC Radio did a broadcast of this. They did a radio version. In the 1960s, it was done as a short radio adaptation, and again in the late 70s, which was broadcast in the United States. I know there are many other radio ones, which are always a little bit random. And I have to admit, the films, we're going to go into Peter Jackson territory here, and I always find it a little bit weird. Peter Jackson's adaptations, I think, are the best. They are my favourite. They are epic. Yes, they change things, and The Two Tower does suffer from adaptation sickness, but overall I think they're my favourites. There was an animation of The Lord of the Rings in the 1970s, which was part animation and part scoped actors. It's interesting. I don't think it's as good as people say it is. It always just leaves me a little bit cold, and there was also another animated one that's best left forgotten. I watched it in preparing for this and thought, ugh. So there is a fan film, The Hunt for Gollum. It's definitely worth watching and checking out. For a fan film, it's extremely well done, and it's so professional. There's been stage versions of The Lord of the Rings, which is so... I mean, a large-scale musical adaptation, which I did see, and I hated. So, yeah. Television has been quite interesting. Amazon have acquired the global television rights to Lord of the Rings, and it will not be a direct adaptation of any of the books, so we'll see what happens with that. So, yeah, I always worry. Apparently it's going to be the most expensive thing in history ever made for television.